It's really an honor and a pleasure to welcome you all this evening to a very special evening effectively dedicated to the renowned poet Polina Barskova, even more dedicated to the Siege of Leningrad, which killed well over 1 million people. And the lifting of that siege occurred on January 27th, 1944. So this coming January 27th will mark the 75th anniversary of the Siege of Leningrad. And it's on the minds of many of us who study the war and the memory of the war. And Professor Barskova, who herself was born in the city of Leningrad. My parents were also born there. I lost many people in the siege, many relatives in the siege. So we're talking about something enormously important. Before introducing Professor Barskova, I would actually like to introduce Mr. Kenneth Randell. Kenneth, if you could stand up for a minute. Thank you. Ken Randell is the founder and director of the International Museum of World War II in Natick, just across from the Natick Mall, where he has a fantastic collection. And I invited him and his wife Shirley Randell to come to this lecture, and they brought with them some wonderful artifacts that those of you who will stay to after the Q&A might want to look at a medal that was given to somebody who was involved in the beginning of the restoration of the city of Leningrad already as early as the spring of 1942. And is actually a medal and certificates and postcards that show drawings of the city of Leningrad, of the city itself and the architecture, not of the starving people falling in the snow, which is on the images that some of us are used to. A book, beautifully illustrated book, that was published in 1944 in the Soviet Union, called Women of the City of Lenin, so Women of the City of Leningrad, and even a book in English, a propaganda book that was published in 1942 in English to try to get, of course, American and English help during the time of the war. So you're welcome to see all these things. And the other thing I just want to say, once I'm showing objects here on this desk, is a little stack of this book, which is for sale, that I will talk about in a minute. So first of all, I'm Nina Tamarkin. I direct Russian area studies, and I really enjoy inviting wonderful people to come and speak, and particularly Polina Barskova, whom I met at the very beginning of this year, I think, at a lecture, and we sort of fell in love. And we met very soon after for lunch and have stayed in good touch ever since. We were together because of her on a panel at a conference in St. Petersburg this summer, having to do with the blockade of the Siege of Leningrad. So Polina Barskova is Associate Professor of Russian Literature at Hampshire College. She received her doctorate from the University of California at Berkeley, and is the author of 12 collections of poetry in Russian, including her latest volume of selected poems called Солнечное утро на площади, This Sunny Morning on the Square. Yeah, Sunny Morning on the Square, 2018. And the author of a collection of short stories called Tableau, right, with an X at the end, right, Tableau, for which she was awarded the Andrei Bely Prize in 2015. 3 collections of her poetry, This Lamentable City, 2010, Zoo in Winter, 2011, and Relocations, 2013, appeared in English translation. She's an editor of the anthology Written in the Dark, named Best Literary Translation into English for 2017 by the Association of American Teachers of Slavic and East European Languages, and of 2 scholarly titles in Russian, a reader about the Siege of Leningrad, and a collection of conference papers about narrative of the siege, and her debut English language monograph, which is really wonderful, and I've read every word, although somehow I couldn't find my copy to bring here to show you, called Besieged Leningrad, Aesthetic Responses to Urban Disaster, which came out in 2017, and written in the dark, 5 Poets in the Siege of Leningrad, is a work of Leningrad poets and in Russian and in English who were trying to make sense of their experience. So if you're interested, actually these books are subsidized, so I'm not a commercial type, but they're for sale for $10. And so if you're interested, come at the end and get this wonderful book of poetry. But this is really not why you're here. You're here to listen to Polina Barskova, and so are we. So Polina, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. I learned from Nina that tonight offered various entertainments to various audiences, and it's kind of wonderful that you chose such a strange one. For me, it's not strange. I've been studying this event for the last 12 years. I never thought in my life that I would be studying this subject. The city where I was born and where I grew up, next to maybe the most voluminous monument at the south of the city, presented a very official and I would say endlessly boring, emotionally, intellectually, historically version of this event, all arrested in granite and gold. And when I left, I thought I would never look back, but these things are completely unpredictable. The talk is called Leningrad at War, The City Speaks. I think it's a wonderful title. It's not mine, it's Nina's. And the idea of a speaking city, of the this historical and cultural notion that produces many and various voices, is very close to how I feel about this thing. Thank you so much for bringing the objects. One thing that happened, and as you might have figured out from the very strange genre of biography, right? When you stand there kind of between life and death and your books are being read onto you. I think there are so many publications significantly because there is so much to do. Not because I endlessly love spending my nights writing about this event. That would be unnatural. But there is certain urgency. And I will try to talk to this urgency. And I will try to explain to you why this whole situation seems to be completely unbelievable and so important for us as biological species to understand. And why there are so many ways to think about it and to learn. For example, this is a postcard, which you can look at it after I talk to you. It's beautiful, I assure you. It's wonderful work of graphic art. It's a lithograph. It depicts certain urban scene, tableau, something that happens in the city, in the siege. What makes it completely unbelievable, though, is that it happened, it was made by a collective of authors in the city that, and maybe this is the moment when I should remind you that not only the city was famined, that million died probably mostly of starvation. But also the city lied for the most of the 1941, 1942, in total darkness, without heating and without electricity, right? So this postcard is one of 1,330 different kinds of postcards that were published in the besieged Leningrad. This is my present project. This is what I'm working at this very moment. And this very fact that the cultural life of the city was so unimaginably rich is one of many reasons why I and other people like me, there are some wonderful colleagues, keep returning to this topic. So maybe this postcard that I didn't know would be here tonight could be some form of illustration or epigraph. And also importantly, very material one. So let's start. Professor Tumarkin already showed you this book, and this is centrally the book that I'll be talking to you about tonight, because I'm endlessly proud, I'm not sure is the exact word. I'm in awe that it exists. This book should not have existed, it should not exist. It is an impossible book. All the poets whose poetry is present in this little volume should have died. What they've written was supposed to disappear for complicated reasons, and nevertheless, in each situation, for its own unbelievable combinations of reasons, what they wrote survived, what they wrote reached us, and various people. My responsibility, I brought these works together for the first time, and I found translators to work together. But this fact that things that history doomed, we think, and then these things don't disappear, this, I think, as I tell my students, this is the reason to study history. This is the reason to go into humanities. This is the reason to resist history and its pressures. So, Siege of Leningrad, September 8th, 1941, January 27th, 1944, 852 days. The fact that nobody in this room remembers, because most of people in this room who study Soviet history remember the number 900 days, which I find absolutely astonishing, and very interesting and very symbolical for how Soviet history was written. And that monument that I mentioned, the monument to the heroical defense of the city, also, again, as I told you, in granite and in gold, it had many times repeated 900 days, 900 days, 900 days. By the way, the best book about this event, by far, I know we're supposed to doubt, unfortunately I don't doubt, the best book about the Siege of Leningrad is written by an American, by a journalist, Harrison Salisbury. And the book in itself is a very interesting story, and how it was created, but it's also called 900 Days. Basically, 900 Days, as I gloomily joke, is a pseudonym for 852 days.
They're like round numbers.
Right, precisely. So people who were in the city didn't like their round numbers, right? Because for a number of reasons where we don't have to go at the moment, most of them died in, most of them became doomed to die in January 1942. At the end of the month, there was a moment that when there was no water in the bread factories. And that's when basically people who hoped that they somehow can imagine some situation of survival, most of them didn't make it. So for them, this week, these 7 days, became hugely important. Not to mention difference between 852 and 900. And when we read the diaries, and this is 90% of what I do, and 90% of what my colleagues do. And there is a beautiful recent book that emerged, also by a young American scholar, Alexis Perry, dedicated to the diaries only. So when you read the siege diaries, you constantly read, if only I can make it to the next month, if only I can make it to the next week. So I think this discrepancy in number of days actually is very telling. Another very telling discrepancy is that we'll never know how many people died, which I think is very important to me personally as a person with dual citizenship. I have a Russian passport, and I bear all kinds of responsibilities as a person with that passport. Russian culture, Soviet culture has many, many qualities. Exactitude in counting our dead is not one of our fortes. And the very thing that I have to tell you now, that the numbers differ from 600,000 to 1.5 million, basically I think speak on its own right. And again, if you read that we will know, please don't believe. During the winter of 1941, 1942, there were cemeteries where they were not counting. But even earlier, for example, when during the autumn of 1941, people arrived to Leningrad running from the Baltic countries, from Tallinn, from Riga, and so on. These were people without ration cards, right? They didn't have any documentation to be in this city. So nobody could count them. And these were the people, the first people to die, obviously. And this whole story is not told. And this is maybe another way for me to bring you to one of the first questions of this story. I give these talks a lot in this country and in Europe and in Russia, in Petersburg. In Petersburg, it's the most difficult thing. Actually, I really prefer to do it in the United States, and I can tell you why. But once after this kind of a talk, I think it was in Philadelphia, a very nice gentleman, elderly gentleman, walked up to me after the end of my talk and said, you know, it was very interesting, and you're kind of nice. I have one question. Is the Siege of Leningrad over yet?
What?
Uh-huh. And I thought, okay, that's the problem of my accent, and what am I doing here anyway? And I took this question home, and then I thought, well, you know what, it's kind of not that absurd. It's not that fairy tale-ish. It's kind of an important question. For example, as we just talked before coming here, some of you might know that rather recently, several years ago, the central oppositional channel, during a poll, asked people in Moscow and Petersburg whether they think that the city should have been opened, right, given to the Nazi forces as many other cities. Kiev and Minsk, Odessa and Sevastopol, or for example, Paris. 20 minutes after it happened, the program was stopped, and very soon the channel was basically arrested. We still wonder whether that was a provocation, actually, whether the question was planted, because it was, and now we feel it also very strongly, a very dangerous question. And the fact that it worked so peculiarly shows huge urgency of this topic for Russia today. And by that I mean that in Putin's Russia, where history unfortunately again becomes a very strong weapon, ideological weapon, the Siege of Leningrad is a ground for lots of controversy. What happened there? Whether what happened there was not maybe so necessary, maybe something else could have happened. All these questions are very painful. And when I go there, and we talked today earlier, that there is a question of building a new museum of the siege in Leningrad, Petersburg today, and discussions around it are really heated. Another way to answer that question, whether the siege is over yet, is the publishing date of this tiny book, which is last year, right? 2016. So if the book is published in 2016, for example, for those in the classroom who teach, in what kind of class should you situate this book? Is it the class about the siege or the class about contemporary culture? When do we think the book happens or publication happens? When something is written or when something is read? Which is a very important question for Soviet history, right? Because until something is read, it doesn't start impacting culture. For those of you who study Soviet culture, for example, the moment when the great novel by Mikhail Bulgakov about the clandestine culture, Master and Margarita, entered the culture, when it enters, it's 1960s. So how do we think about its creation? So these are some of the reasons why I think siege is not over yet. We don't know much about it. We're still trying to figure out how we read it. And it's still being used very heavily in the ideological narratives. Another question or suggestion that I want to offer that is very important when I study this topic is, again, going back to Professor Tumarkin's witty suggestion, the city speaks. It's an allegory. Cities don't speak. Citizens speak, right? And nevertheless, I wanted to introduce you to two poets who in the way represent a huge spectrum in which this situation spoke, in which this city spoke, and kind of they are two poles, if you wish, of this bipolar historical tragedy and its representation. So the first poet is the best known poet of this event, an amazing woman, Olga Bergholz. Everything about her is striking, I assure you, starting with looks. She looked like Marlene Dietrich, and she sounded more or less like Marlene Dietrich. And how she sounded is a little bit more important than how she looked. And I will tell you in a moment why. Olga Bergholz was the official poet of this event. She was allowed to publish basically with a minimal intervention of the censorship. I'm telling you this because I saw the files of her texts written for radio. And this is how her poetry was coming to people in the city first, and then it was published in the newspapers and books and all that. But the first publication was happening on the radio several times a week. This is very important because radio was by far the most important media in the besieged city. Newspapers were published, again, with the interruption of that week in January. But because there was, as you can imagine, very significant lack of postmen, or rather postwomen, they were exhausted. They couldn't reach the outskirts of the city. The newspapers were glued in the central avenue, the Nevsky Prospect. That's it, during the worst winter. So either you had to walk to the center, which was luxury nobody really could afford, or you were not able to read the newspapers. The only source of information was radio that worked in every apartment, because if you would switch it off, you would be arrested. And why you would be arrested? Because if you would switch it off, you wouldn't be able to hear the sound of the air siren warning you about the approaching Nazi planes, right? So at the moments, at the hours when there were no signals or about bombing and shelling, there was programming. Music, lots of music, programming for children, all kinds of official news about which everybody knew that they had ideally nothing to do with any reality. For the most of 1941, according to the official news, Soviet army was doing rather well, which, as we know, wasn't so. And then rather often, this magic voice would interrupt fake news and music by the great Russian composers of the 19th century. And she would read her poetry about the siege, which is a totally fascinating subject, because, for example, now we know that there were two channels of radio. There was a channel for the city, coming from within the city, and the channel for the land outside of the city, Большая Земля, with different information about what was happening. Which again, I'm interviewed a lot today about propaganda, because I think my knowledge and understanding that I kind of put together by crumbs about how propaganda worked in the besieged city, at some point you understand that propaganda is one of the most sophisticated systems out there. It's brilliant. So Bergholz wrote for both channels, and these were different kinds of information. And I'm happy to answer your questions about how different it was. Bergholz survived the siege. She even was allowed, which was extremely rare, to fly in and out the city. They interviewed her in Moscow several times about the mood, the настроение в городе, the mood in the city, the spirit in the city. And every time she would return, because it was really exciting to be the muse of the city, that voice. And when you ask people who were in the city, and now children of the people who were in the city, they do remember her. It's all true when we say that she was important. So after the siege was over and many other things happened, eventually at some point authorities decided that they should commemorate what happened in some form, and they created one symbolical space of veneration, which is called the Piskaryovskaya Cemetery. And since I'm in the presence of the person who wonderfully studies memory of that war, one of the strangest things happened a year ago when I went to that cemetery. I've never been in my life at the absolutely pristinely empty cemetery. It's as empty as it gets, which also gives us various questions about what's happening today in real life, not in ideological surreality. And for that cemetery, they decided to build some kind of monument, it's a stela, and on it, they decided to engrave, again in gold, Russia is big on its gold, these lines by Bergholz, which I will read to you in a moment. It just another thing that I have to tell you, that the whole deal with burial during the siege is very important. The whole city was a cemetery, as you can imagine. If you think about it, if you study these things, they were not burying, as we just discussed. Nobody was burying in that city. To bury meant diamonds. In order to bury your relative, only jewelry worked. In the situation of the radical famine of the winter. So basically, most of people in the city would leave their family in the streets. And we have endless descriptions of that. So the idea that there would be a neat, beautiful cemetery covered with tulips, I think to me is somewhat controversial. And I would personally prefer many signs in the city that would reflect the reality of the siege with more honesty and urgency. Nevertheless, they did what they did. They did what they needed to do in during the late phase of the memorial effort in the Soviet Union. And this is what this poem reads. Here lie Leningraders. Here lie citizens, men, women, children. Next to them are Red Army soldiers with their very lives. They defended Leningrad, cradle of the revolution. We cannot recount their noble names here, so many rest under the eternal protection of this granite, but you who fix your attention on the stones know this. Nobody, nothing has been forgotten. As we discussed before with the students in class, right, this reads really pleasantly, I think. Huge comfort comes from this line, especially from the last line, which became sort of historical motto of the siege memory, the idea that nobody, nothing has been forgotten. But since I already told you that we're kind of missing like a million counting, 600, by the way, is the number that was pronounced during the Nuremberg trial, where authorities of Leningrad declared that this is what they found. Basically, a huge number of people who died, arguably one of the worst deaths possible, were forgotten, and that Bergholz writes over it gives us today, when we're reading about them, when we read letters, when we read postcards, when we read diaries, gives us various kinds of doubt, to say the least, about the official narrative. When I say this in many audiences, right, people become upset for Bergholz, or people become upset at Bergholz. And both readings, I think, severely simplify her. Yeah?
We're wondering about Bergholz. Did people...
Let's wait. Let's wait till the end.
Okay.
Questions at the end.
Yeah. One of the most amazing siege diaries published at the moment is hers. It's voluminous. It's many hundreds of pages. It's absolutely shocking because it shows, I think now it's in the process of translation by Princeton. One of the things that it shows that Bergholz knew very well everything that was happening in the city. She knew about huge discrepancy of how authorities treated people with privileges and without privileges. She knew that while for her it was possible to leave the city and to come back, for hundreds of thousands it was not so, and so on. And she writes about it in her diary. And the relationship with this diary, I think, is a very telling one. Recently, since we study this, we talk, people like me, and somebody asked me, okay, so you don't want granite, you don't want gold, you don't want figurative. What do you want? What kind of monument do you want? I say, I have an idea. I want somebody to come up with the idea of how to turn monumental a diary that is being periodically buried. Bergholz would bury her diary several times because she was very afraid of arrest. And actually they arrested her in 1937 and she was tortured. And she was sure that this would happen again. Simultaneously, being ambitious and brilliant, she couldn't have stopped writing this. And in her diary, she writes several times that now is time to hide the diary again. So I think one of the best ways to describe severe and exciting madness of this whole story would be to write a monologue of the diary that is being buried and unburied, buried and unburied. And we even know the bench after which she would be burying it. So Bergholz, the most vocal, the most publishable, the most recognizable voice of the Siege of Leningrad with her regularly disappearing diary. And to that, I want to juxtapose another text. Because history, as you might have heard, is completely nuts, recently we found out that these two had an affair in 1930s. Two of the, according to some of us, most important poets of the siege and most dissimilar poets of the siege even met, to put it this way. Gennady Gor is the least publishable poet of the whole story. And as I told during our conversation earlier, he wrote his poems 2 months after he was evacuated, which is actually an interesting thing that many people wrote immediately after they were taken out of the city, during the spring or summer of 1942, because there was a huge evacuation after the winter, which is a very interesting, rather unbearable story of what actually happened. So he is, as many people who were evacuated, he found himself in Siberia. Usually the directions of evacuation are Siberia, Perm, or Kazakhstan, Alma-Ata. He found himself in some form of safety, and he starts writing poetry like that. I will read it out loud to you, a fragment. But again, if I could, in the perfect imperfect world, I would kind of superimpose these two texts to completely embarrass us into understanding and confuse us. So, okay, we read, nothing is forgotten. Here lie Leningraders, they are all heroical and beautiful. Don't eat my leg, let go of my tongue. God knows how I'm used to praying to God. Don't eat my arm, let go of my thigh. And don't throw it together with science into the bucket. Don't eat my eye with derision, visions, demon, it's watching you. Don't eat my ear, don't touch my nose. To me, my ear is my gut. To you, my nose is garbage. What's the deal with this text? How we should read it? What's the story of its publication? Why it upsets us so much? And why I think it's so endlessly important that we read it and that we read it together with Olga Bergholz. Supposedly, the really upsetting thing about it, that it is, of course, a poem about cannibalism. For decades, the siege's most hidden secret. Though actually, and people ask me a lot about it. And yes, there was cannibalism. I don't believe it's possible otherwise. We are talking about, at the beginning of the siege, the population in the city, again, more or less, was 2.5 million, locked without food for at least until March 1942. But since the only institution, other than the institutions publishing postcards, that worked in the city was, of course, secret police. That worked really nicely. We have information about the scale of cannibalism. It was considerably less than people thought. There was huge mythology. There was huge gossip in the city. There was real anxiety, as you can imagine. Gore writes about this fear, and then poem becomes stranger and stranger. Another taboo for decades in talking about the siege, it was basically prohibited to talk about mental disorders during the siege. And the poem, in a way, shows kind of this perfect list of prohibited things. The poet himself understood that this cannot be published. He hid this notepad, and until his children found it after his death, we didn't know about it. And since I interviewed the whole family, one of my favorite details is that sometimes he would tell people that he wrote something strange and it exists. And they would ask, so read. He was a famous Soviet writer. And he would escape that conversation. But here it is, I think, in a very strong English translation. The notepad that shows very, very different version of the events, that shows destruction of the human being, that shows descent into madness, and that shows total crisis of subjectivity, right? Something very, very different from this glorious text. There are many reasons, since I suspect I'm slowly running out of time, if it happens. And there are many reasons why I think it's absolutely necessary to study this, just because it's, it would be somewhat desirable to undo the disaster of historical amnesia. There is something unbearable about the idea that, as with every fact of genocide, that somebody decides for you to talk or not to talk, how to die, how your parents will die, and things like this. But also, I think when we look at these two texts out of thousands of poetic texts, what we see is amazing power that state has over us when it chooses its narratives, right? This is the Siege of Leningrad. It's in granite, it's in gold. I grew up reading this. Everybody in the city grew up reading this. It's granite. More generations will be growing up reading this. This is the actual experience. They have nothing to do with each other. And going back to the question that I suggested, so very often when I have to write these talks, or to schedule these talks, or to create some kind of notes, what is the kind of imaginable beginning? The Siege of Leningrad is an unknown event of the modern history. It's not true. It's a very known event of the modern history. In the United States, people know about it. The paradox, the real tragedy of this event, I think, and it's very important in many cases when we think about totalitarian states, state that chooses to control very tightly narratives, that this event is known not in the way that it happened. And when I tell people the Siege of Leningrad, they nod. They think about things that they learned at school. They think about the books that they've read. And the idea that this present moment, when we still can go to the archives, though actually the situation tightens, right? And Putin tightens the archival access. Recently, you can see for example, the document of the arrest only if this is your direct relative, which wasn't like this 10 years ago. So again, going back to some thinking about this little book. So these are poets, all of whom witnessed, all of whom survived, all of whom wrote about the siege. And I think making these narratives and making these voices of wisdom and of witness and of despair accessible is absolutely urgent, kind of to create this multi-layered text of what happened. Though without romanticizing it and asking difficult questions. For example, a question that interests me personally: why is it important that it's poetry? Why this being poetry supposedly adds something to our knowledge? Does it add something to our knowledge? That it's a cultural aesthetic text. So this is another one that I really, really appreciate. And maybe this will be the last text for tonight. And the last problem. So, you saw the poem by Gore, with its completely broken syntax, broken sequence, and awful images and fragments of observation. Vladimir Sterligov, also one of the amazing artists of that moment. Spoon raised to the lips, death. Hand outstretched in order to hello, death. Saw a little goldfinch, death. On the branch a little leaf, death. You go on a walk with your friends, death. Looked at the cabbage on the plate, death. You see your friends off, two of them, death. Happened to glance to the side, death. Right? The text of total linguistic poverty, absence and lack, which I think amazingly reflects what was happening. That is it. About the poetry, let's talk. Let's see how you react to this, how you agree and disagree. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for this part. Okay, questions? Yes.
Wait, can you go back one slide?
Yeah.
Wait, sorry. No, what was the name of the other problem?
Olga Bergholz.
Bergholz, that's what I'm looking for. So Bergholz, were people resentful of her because she got to leave and not have to starve or anything while everyone else was forced to stay?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. That's an important question. Actually, and this is another topic that we only now start researching, seriously speaking, is the question, and for many people in the city, it was one of the most bewildering aspect of what was happening. It's the difference between situations during the siege and the notion of the privileges. And I think sometimes when I'm asked why it's important, so important, and so productive to study this subject for a historian, I think it's an amazing lens for what we think to be Soviet, what we think to be Soviet at that moment. For example, huge difference between styles of lives of people in different social situations. Bergholz was an official poet, which means that she had certain power and certain possibilities that other people didn't have. She was a member of party. She was very high in the literary department. And as such, what she was able to do couldn't absolutely be compared to other people who didn't have these privileges. And also, actually, I'm not sure I can, your actual question is very complicated. Whether people who didn't have privileges were upset. Many of them, this is another very important thing I think about Soviet state for me, is that on some level there was understanding which was shaped for decades that this was the order, that people connected to the party and that people who had people who had responsibility, they kind of owned this. I read only her diary. I didn't read diaries around her. So that would be my answer. Supposedly she traveled because it was her ideological task. But yes, she traveled and she ate in Moscow.
In Petersburg.
In
Moscow,
Moscow,
and
yes.
she ate there, right?
Yeah.
Why didn't, I didn't quite get why the Soviet state didn't like her diary and tortured her for it.
Well, they tortured her earlier.
Right. She was arrested in
It was
1937.
the great year of the Great Terror, the Purge of Terror under Stalin.
No, but I thought you said it was because of her diary.
Her diary started earlier. The diary, she started her diary in the 1930s.
Okay, what was it about her diary that was that the Soviet state considered?
As you also know, Soviet state, especially in the 1930s, would arrest without
For like very little, but like
or nothing, right? And then when it became known that there was a diary, that was a problem. There is a remarkable scholar of the siege, Nikita Lomagin.
Right, I know him.
Right. Most of his research is based on the diaries that he found in the archive of the secret police. Diaries so people knew that they could have been arrested. Nevertheless, they were writing their diaries, and they were arrested and shot. So you tell me.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm currently a professor of American history class, and we're talking a lot about memory and the war. And you spoke to the importance of studying the reality of the war and where it really happened under the siege.
Mm-hmm.
But do you think the public is ready for that? Are they willing to accept that memory, or are they okay with the current story that's out there?
Mm-hmm. It's a very complicated question, I think. And when we say public, we say every particular person. Kind of, if we would like to think in terms of some commonality, there are several astutely competing narratives at the moment. What I see happening from above, so to say, from Putin himself and from his Ministry of Culture, is to bring back the monumental kind of narrative of the absolutely heroical community, society of courage. And this is what I'm trying to resist in terms of tiny books. And this is what my colleagues are trying to resist in terms of their bigger books. And actually, I think For me, what is another thing that is so troubling about this particular text, this particular narrative, that Bergholz here and elsewhere is creating this idea of the collective body of the city. While what I think should be done, and what is being done, and what is also possible, is to try to go to the individual stories and individual fates, and to publish these documents, and to see huge difference between the stories, right? And I told you, even if in a sketchy way, because actually it's a huge, very complicated story, life story of Olga Bergholz. But even her story is so controversial, I think, right? The official poet, very successful. Not only she published on the radio and on the monuments, but also newspapers and books, but simultaneously writing a secret text against her officialdom. So this kind of duality, this, I think, what makes this so interesting and so difficult. She is one of the most representative figures in this duality. Gore, after the war, became rather well-known Soviet writer, writing sci-fi texts about wonderful citizens of the Soviet state traveling to the other planets, bringing good news. And when I began talking about him and writing about him, and in my attempts to explain this completely inexplicable thing, people from Leningrad, Petersburg, would look at me in total disbelief. That this cannot be that very, very well-behaving Soviet writer. Well, this is that very, very well-behaving Soviet writer. And I think now in our studies of things Soviet, basically this is where we are. No black, no white, but huge complexities of the dialogue between the individual and the state. And when I say this, and when I say that I think that the siege is a lens, this is, at least for me, it became a lens. What is the price of the postcard? Actually, it has a price. It's 40 kopecks. And it's also interesting, another topic that is growing, we study economics of the siege, or rather various kinds of economics of the siege, the official one and the black market that was thriving. But actually the price of this postcard, of course, equals life, and life of the family of the artist. There are several diaries of the artists who worked on these postcards. And if your work for the official ideological document is accepted, then you are given a special ration, and your family lives. If your work is not accepted and is not approved, and there are several stories. For example, a story of Tatiana Glebova, an amazing avant-garde artist who at some point decided to save her father, a remarkable piano player. And she decided that she would go, and this is a conversation about style, which is also very interesting. This is why culture is interesting, again. That she would create postcards in the style of Soviet realism. And she would bring these postcards to the person who had power to accept or not to accept. And he knew very well her game, that actually she was a radical, experimental, avant-garde artist. And he would tell her time and time again to go home and improve, to go home and improve. By the way, walking home was 10 hours, right? I remind you, no electricity. So sometimes I think just kind of writing about this dialogue only would create a very interesting insight about why we study culture of this moment. So of course, her publisher, Valentin Serov, played his game properly, and her father died, and the postcard was not accepted. But again, this is why I think what you're doing, collecting material memory and material culture of the disaster, can be so hugely interesting and important.
Is the issue that you brought up earlier about the new museum in Leningrad, is it exactly what you're talking about? More of a memorial as opposed to the personal?
Right. So as you already can guess, this is precisely the conversation that is happening now, that is extremely poignant. Because as I said that I much prefer to talk about this in the United States, and I can explain why. There are several reasons. Talking about it in Petersburg is almost unbearable, because we have several very strong points of view. We have Soviet point of view that is being brought back as we speak, and we have point of view of, let's say, generation that grew up with Gorbachev, that says, open the archives, open the archives. And usually there are all these people in the room. And usually, in equally painful way, there would be a person, and at this point I recognize, who is a child who grew up during the siege. We don't have the survivors anymore, which is another huge tragedy of what we, people like me, we didn't do. Right? Americans, basically, let's be honest, Americans did it for the Holocaust. Like Spielberg Foundation and Blavatnik Foundation, several foundations interviewed. We didn't. Voices are gone. The only thing that we have now is, again, diaries.
But, I mean, surely there would be like some people who are like, who would like that they'd be young during the siege, who would still be alive and old right now.
Right, but this is whom we're interviewing. But this is a huge difference between writing down memories, that would be memories of somebody who was in the situation of responsibility, and somebody who was 6. Especially since we're talking about recording these memories many, many, many decades later. Because again, then there is a huge difference between witness during and various kinds of memorial practices. Now, during the last 5 years, several teams began working on writing down memories of people who were children. And there is a conversation about that. And about that, we understand that that should be included into the museum if the museum really would happen. The problems are many. Already, what happened is that there is a very problematic conversation about how this museum should look like. Right? And unpleasant people like me speak about experience of Washington, speak about experience of Berlin, and speak about the experience of the memorial of 9/11, with huge discussion, public discussion about this, which is not necessarily what is happening today in Petersburg. So several traditions of how to deal with public memory are in competition. It might be interesting to observe, but it's incredibly difficult to be a part of.
Yeah.
No, I was involved in the Gdansk Museum, in,
Yep.
in that whole story, in that tragedy.
Yeah.
Wait, what
And-
story are you talking
We were talking about Gdansk and Poland.
And they knew that they were going to run into trouble. And when I got the invitation to the opening, the director said, "Don't buy a refundable ticket." A non-refundable ticket, and it was canceled. But what I was thinking when you were describing all of this, the woman who ran the museum in Petersburg, when I was there, I don't know, 5 years
Well,
ago,
yeah,
10
that's
10 years
what's her
ago.
name. Maybe I was, you know,
And
Dasha, what's her name again?
she was showing me the,
Milena?
Milena, what's her Tsetakova. Yeah, Milena Tsetakova, yeah.
and she said, she was showing me through all the storage areas, and, because I'm really interested in the people perspective of
Right.
all of this. And she said, the problem is that in Russia, we all know what the future is. It's the knowledge of the past that keeps changing. And it sounds like it is all over the place. But, you know, I'd also point out that the idea of memorializing has happened every place. I think an awful lot of people who go through the horrors of war need to find glory, because there isn't any other way they can remember it, because the reality will drive them to alcoholism and endless depression. We used to be very upset at our museum that soldiers up to about 70 or 75 years old would bring their grandchildren and talk about the glory. But when they got to 80, they talked about the horror. And they talked about what really happened. And how unbearable it was to remember any of this.
Thank you so much. What you're saying is very important to me. And one of the reasons why I basically at this point, I think sometimes emotionally prefer to talk about this in the United States. Well, my daughter is reading Anna Frank diary. Right, this is the answer in school.
She's
Right,
in middle school.
Holocaust.
She's in ninth grade.
Right, Holocaust as basically exercise in understanding how unbearably history works, and that you should read it, that it's your responsibility. I think it's hugely important. When I enter new Russian, Putin, post-Soviet, call it what you wish, audiences, this exercise never happened. And all that people read in various nuances is the conversation about glory, right? And then I bring them this, then I bring them gore. So what I'm doing, obviously, I'm a girl with strange American pronunciation who wants to take their glory from them. To which I say that what I'm trying to do is to individualize stories and to tell about particulars of what happened. And again, that when we read Bergholz, it's important to remember that she had an open and refundable ticket to the city and outside of the city. And Gore, as many of the protagonists, as I told you before, buried his parents. And actually the whole thing, somehow to me, this is very central to the story. That again, the ration card, right? Everybody in the city, almost everybody in the city, everybody with a passport in the city, which is also important, with the ID card, was given a ration card. There were several types of ration cards. To the question of whether there were social jealousies. Yes, there were social jealousies. So if you worked, crudely speaking, you had a little bit more bread and jam. And if you were of certain age, which is over 65, you had a ration card that was absolutely declaration of death sentence. That very 125 grams, they counted. Nobody could have survived on that. So generation of parents was doomed. And for me also, again, when they ask me how this is connected to Russia today, this is connected to Russia today. This is connected to the overall state dealing with the people who don't work anymore. I think, again, when we look at the siege, it's just a very strong, very radical, if you wish, kind of everything that exists overall in Soviet system can be seen there, but stronger. The price of a human life in comparison to how one values the military plant and things like this. The best thing that would be possible about that museum, I think, And when I am asked about that, just please help us to publish the diaries. If only there would be computers with diaries, and if only there would be scanners, that people who are still hiding diaries of their grandparents would come and scan. And by the way, take the diaries home, because this is another story, another lecture, another set of information. But the first siege museum, the famous Rakov Siege Museum that was created in 1943, was arrested in 1946 with everything that was there. When Stalin changed his idea about the plight of Leningrad. So, the whole conversation about the museum is impossibly charged. And nevertheless, I think something should exist. Because last time, in August, when I went there, I met, by the way, with people of your age, children of the survivors. And it's interesting, the generational thing is there. They said, we don't want this museum, they told me. We don't want a museum created by the Putin's ideology. Just, to which I say, if we don't have anything today, these documents disappear. 40 years later, I am not sure these documents exist. So this is the conversation that is happening, one of many conversations.
It won't exist.
Right?
Well, I have a question about either like the Bergholz, people listen to all this on the radio. Did this, sort of the other question is, under these horrific conditions with people living in isolated ways, I remember you once, I guess you wrote in your book about how people resonated to reading Robinson Crusoe during the siege because every apartment felt like an island unto itself. So listening to this kind of poetry, even this heroic poetry, did that at the time sustain people's spirits? I mean, sort of on the one hand, we can condemn it. I mean, I would condemn it as a monument, and of course, what you didn't point out is that last line, which is often translated, no one, well, никто не забыт, ничто не забыт, so no one is forgotten, nothing is forgotten, is such a lie. I mean,
No, I think this was the point of my lecture.
So, but I mean, for the whole Soviet cult of the war is, a lot of that was to forget what the war was really like, as you were saying.
To rewrite.
Right. But during the war, during the siege, was this a positive thing? Did you think that it helped people get through from day to day to actually hear this? You know, the way you march and you sing the songs. Like when I walk around Lake Waban listening to Soviet military music, hey, I'm not as tired.
This is the conversation that and again, this is the conversation that I think many of us have, and this is when military historians begin screaming at me usually, because usually in the room of military historian, I am the only younger woman and quasi-American. So my position is really entertaining. At this point, they ask me, do you understand that during the military action, in order for there to be morale, there needs to be propaganda? Do you understand that? To which I usually say that I do understand that, but I also have some questions. And what again, since we have only several lines by Bergholz, and she wrote like voluminously, it was her moment. Also going back to what you mentioned, after they arrested her, tortured her into miscarriage, and then allowed her to return to the Soviet society, it was a huge personal moment of ambition for her. And her siege glory for her was kind of even more important than maybe we can imagine. But actually, yes, I think that listening to this absolutely magnificent voice reading beautiful poetry. It's amazingly rhymed. It's beautiful, what we call beautiful Russian poetry, right? In comparison to this, that we don't call beautiful Russian poetry. Just kind of a tiny lesson of literature. And what is the other most famous story of the siege? It's, of course, the story of the 7th Symphony by Shostakovich. Right, amazing music, resounds over the city, all these pictures of people looking at the sources of sounds in the streets. And there is a story behind that, that when they decided to play the 7th Symphony, they understood that what they needed, an orchestra. And they decided to put an orchestra together. And we found 3 diaries: violinist, the flute player, and the woman who was trying to dress them. Which, as maybe you can imagine, is a situation. Because they all were weighing like 35, 45 kilos. And you have, this is dystrophy, right? Think of the pictures of the camps that you've seen. So these people, the idea was to put them on the stage, to play a hugely complicated piece of music. So they describe, the musicians describe that for them it was a chance, for them it was a torture, just physical torture, physiological. For them it was extremely, as you said, morale and spirit affirming. To see these postcards without me telling you stories, it's amazing and spirit affirming. This is Leningrad and Petersburg art at its best, subtle, nuanced. If I tell you the story of this girl schlepping through the city again and again and again, trying to save her father and failing, this is a different story, right? So, yes, the sound Shostakovich is absolutely affirming. The story of the violinist Margulis, who has to somehow walk to the rehearsal, or he will die, and his family dies because at the rehearsal they were feeding them, adds certain context to the whole Shostakovich story. Or back to your question, because people ask me about Shostakovich all the time, and it's one of the most beautiful pieces of music, I think, ever. But I remind you that Shostakovich was lifted out of the city mid-September, which I think is very, very interesting, right? So there are several stories. There are many stories of the symphony. There are many stories when we talk about the siege poetry. I'm writing the book now that I'm thinking I will call siege poetries, because this is this notion of plurality that is so important for me, and of difference.
Julie.
Are there still recordings, radio recordings? Oh, so you can listen today?
No.
No? Oh, there aren't?
Basically, they erased it in 1946. I just recently discussed it because we're kind of... I'm working now, and this is a different topic, and it's something I would write somewhere. There are several very interesting film texts, as we say pretentiously, about the siege. And actually, we're trying to understand how much was filmed. It's a very interesting story. There are also a couple of contemporary documentaries. The best one, I think, is made by a Dutch woman aged 26. This is why when I'm like in non-Russian audiences, I feel this is the girl who maybe will make the next movie. Who knows? Because when I met this Dutch film director, I couldn't believe it, right? She would be an atrocity in the Petersburg audience. Like pink running shoes, some green sweater, everything from Amsterdam. So she went to interview, and what she understood there is how people have problems talking about this. You can hear me having problems. I think at this point I have problems because I'm kind of bubbling from all this material. It's basically too much. And of course we need an institute. And of course they won't give us an institute. And what that Dutch girl, the movie is called also 900 Days with a question mark. The author is Jessica Gorter, Gorter. So she made a documentary about awkwardness of narratives that people give today about these events. And for me, this is very important. The fact that today we don't know how to talk about it.
What do you think people are afraid of to have a really open discussion and knowledge of all of this? I mean, people, I also wanted to ask you a question about Putin, but as to whether he's evolved into a different point of view now. Blavatnik makes a really big point that Putin gave a year's salary towards the museum in Moscow that Blavatnik did. Not my kind of museum, but anyhow. You know, whenever I hear about people suppressing things when to the exclusion of the people's stories and wanting to suppress all of this, what is it what do you think people are afraid of? Why not make all of this open? I mean, it's all human. These are human stories. This is human history. It's how people dealt with this. It doesn't matter whether you like the poem or not. It's how a person who was there dealing with all the emotions, realities, and fears, it's how they came across. I never understand why people are against that.
You know, at some point I think,
Lucky you.
well, there, again, so I have this, and believe me, when I talk to my colleagues in this topic, right, I'm a representative of a group. So as a representative of a group, I spend some evenings trying to fall asleep thinking about like what would be the monument, for example. Sometimes I think about this diary that goes up and down, up and down. Sometimes my recent thing is a cat.
A cat.
A cat.
A cat?
I want there to be a monument to the siege cat.
You mean got eaten?
Yeah. In many diaries, it's the moment when the family cat gets eaten, which is usually beginning of December, is basically when the catastrophe starts. And they write about it, some of the most unbelievable pages of people understanding, because at first, for several months, power of denial, maybe this is one way I can approach your question, as you know, is one of the most amazing powers in our capacity. So, and again, this is an amazing propaganda apparatus, right? So September, October, things will become better soon. Soon they will reopen the stores. The leaders of the city say wonderful things. So it will somehow, we'll get out of it. By sometime mid-November, when corpses begin emerging in the streets, situation changes. One amazing thing about this is when we found out a научно-популярный film, a documentary. No, it's a teaching film that was made for the hospitals in the city, because in many hospitals, doctors were not understanding what was happening when the first bodies emerged of these people who ran from Baltics. They couldn't believe that this was famine, which I also think is very, very interesting, the power of disbelief. So kind of all these phases of despair and all these phases of clarity. And for many families, especially for intelligentsia families, why it's important? Because this is something I know about, this is my subspecialty. And these are families that write, because I use diaries, a diary needs to be written. So in many of these documents, it's when the cat is doomed, they understand that the family is doomed. Which I think is a very important moment, and I talk about it a lot, and they hate me a lot for this. And then people come up to me and say, do you really believe that people want to know that their family ate their cat? Or do you think they would prefer to read that their mother, father, grandmother, and grandfather were these amazing citizens, constantly sharing bread and offering bread to the strangers, going to schools and the museums and so on? Which version are you ready to go with? And also, to add to your question, I understand that these are things you thought about a lot. It doesn't always mean that we have answers. We have an example of Germany, right, with a huge education of people in order to accept what happened. Such things need amazing programs of education. And so we have understanding of this. And then we have Putin and Medinsky with dozens of movies and books at the moment about glory of Soviet weapon. Again, in 2018. This, I think, is the most kind of offensive thing for me, that we thought it was all over. In 1991, I suggest you ask your friends to switch on the first channel of Putin's TV.
I see. Right. Hadley had a question. Yeah.
Yes, I was wondering, you mentioned the two different channels of the radio, one giving information and news from inside the city and then from outside. So I was curious if it was intended for both of those to reach inside the city, or if that was just something that happened.
And I promised that I would come back to this question, because it's an amazing question. And you asked me whether one can hear the materials, right? So no, materials were mostly erased, but the records of the materials are there, still unpublished. And again, when I think of an awful scenario that would be, there could be a dozen more of me, half of this dozen would be publishing only materials of the radio archive, because they're fascinating. And the fascinating part is how censorship creates a narrative. Writer writes, then you bring it to the censor, and censor creates the text. And this is what makes it so interesting. You see how basically through the mind of the censor, the official narrative is done in front of your eyes, in editing. Black, red, black, red. And we have information for both channels, right? So ask me, what is the difference? I wrote recently about this. Of course, people in the city knew what was happening in the city. You would be amazed to what extent Большая Земля, the big land, the major land, whatever, didn't know. You would be amazed to what extent the big land didn't want to know.
I mean, about this,
about the famine,
really
about the famine, right? Because when I say that,
Russia, you mean?
Bergholz writes in her diary
USSR.
that she went to Moscow and she talked to several famous Soviet writers, and she was shocked to know that nobody knows about the famine. Okay, during the evacuation, and there was some evacuation during the winter. Very small in comparison to what was needed.
After they built the road.
Right,
The ice.
ice road. The so-called road of life, known in the population as road of death, because it was so poorly organized.
Wait, I don't get it. What would the road of life, death, whatever for?
The road over the ice of the lake through which they were evacuating the population.
So in order that people from
Leningrad.
get to where?
Anywhere.
Anywhere out
Anywhere
of the
where they're
city.
And bring food in.
But,
Okay.
But it didn't work in practice. Why exactly?
Why exactly?
Why exactly didn't it work in practice?
Great question. First of all, they built it. What was happening that this route was mercilessly bombed all the time by the Nazis, and in general, the German knowledge of what was happening in the city was completely amazing. This is a different topic, but the extent of transparency of life in the city for the Germans, we learn many things from German archives at the moment. So basically, thousands of people died during the process of evacuation on the ice. They went under, right? So this is why the road of death. Bergholz goes to Moscow and tries to talk about it, and she's shocked that nobody knows. But people are evacuated, and they look like skeletons. And all we know about human beings that we gossip. How can it be that this knowledge doesn't go further about what was actually happening in the city? This is the question about human nature that really interests me. Back to the question about radio. So, information for Leningrad, broadcasting for Leningrad. The city is suffering, there is famine, but all this is happening for the victory. It's a sacrifice that is explained by the future victory. And by the way, victory happened, right? So this is the argument of the pro-Putin regime at the moment. The sacrifice happened for a good reason. Going back to the poll by that little channel that we discussed. The broadcasting for Moscow and the big land, the city is basically absolutely fine. And things that we find in the archives describing life in the city for outside of the city, you just cannot believe power of this text. My favorite phrase, and I think this is called the cluster of the articles, the blissful afternoon in the siege.
The what?
Blissful afternoon in the siege.
Right.
Well, I think it's 20 of 10. And blissful, this has been a blissful evening.
And actually blissful night, right?
We don't want our dear Polina Barskova to feel over. You've been a rapt, attentive audience, and I really want to thank Polina Barskova for a really very, except she's not ready to stop talking.
Right.
So she-
I'm not sure that, and again, fully understanding gravitas and extent of how painful this material is. So seriously speaking, what I can ask you to do, and what is absolutely necessary, I can ask you to read what we publish. Because one of the main problems that I think is happening, for example, in Russia today, is that people are not ready to read what is being published. And this is a more difficult problem for me at this point. I figured out how to publish. There are wonderful publishing houses, 3 of them. But to convince people that this kind of unbearable, disturbing, strange material, that this is kind of our task to read it.
It's hard.
It's hard. Thank you.
Right, thank you.